Good afternoon and welcome to a special tour. You are part of a historic movement here on campus. For the first time ever for homecoming, we're bringing the NAS Museum to you. How about that? Due to the government shutdown, we're not able to do our normal routine, but we're glad that you've taken part of your Saturday to join us for this special presentation. And basically what we're going to do here is kind of walk you through the museum as if we were on a tour. The upside is that we don't have all the ambient noise to deal with, and we're right here in nice, comfortable, air-conditioned circumstances. We don't have to drive 45 minutes one way or the other, so we're making the best of the situation. I'm reminded as we start here that back in 1903, there was a special confab that met in London, England. It was actually a group of radical socialists and communists that had been kicked out of Russia. So they met in London, and they were trying to determine what the future of the Communist Party should look like. And there was one group, kind of led by Trotsky, who said, we need to open party membership up to each and all who wish to be a part. And then this lean, aquatine man stood up and said, are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? A communist is a dead man on furlough. Someone who is so committed to the cause, it's as if they've already died. We've got to have very tight, controlled party membership. His name was Lenin, V.I. Lenin. And there were 46 or 47 delegates there. By the time he finished and it was all said and done, they were down to just 7 delegates left. And he looked out at that group of 7 and said, the hand of history is on you. And so I want you to know that the hand of history is on you. Not that you're a communist, but for taking time to join us here today. We're excited about the prospects. The NAS, National Museum of Naval Aviation, is the largest in the world. 150 aircraft. And they're not replicas. Those are restored aircraft, some of them yanked out of Lake Michigan, where they had crash landed during pilot training. They sat in water for decades and then were extricated and refurbished and put on display. We're not going to obviously be able to touch on all of those aircraft. I've chosen to select those that I think have stories to tell. And we're just going to imagine we're headed to the museum. I've put together some clips based on former tours, and also I've done some on-site, inside presentations. Those of you that are survivors of HI 101, 102 have heard these along the way. So some of those are targeted toward an online audience and whatnot, but they pertain to us equally well here today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our tour as we get started. Welcome to the National Museum of Naval Aviation, right here in Pensacola, Florida. I've long argued that I think it should be a graduation requirement from Pensacola Christian College that everyone take a tour of the Naval Museum. There is behind me a treasure trove. Airplanes of every sort and variety you can imagine. The IMAX theater, every one of those films is just fantastic through and through. Some of you are taking this course from quite a distance away, and so we're going to take you on a quick virtual tour, just a few highlights here, and I want to make one stop in particular that I think might be of interest to you. And maybe this will pique your interest so that when you come back to college the next semester, or perhaps when your family comes for your graduation, you can make it a point to visit the National Museum of Naval Aviation too. Through the beautiful glass doors, and right in front of us is this beautiful bronze image. It's made up of 5 aviators, and this is the spirit of naval aviation, as it's called. There's a representative from World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and then the Persian Gulf War. And it's intended to pay tribute to those who served our country and are serving. It's also to say thank you to those who did not return. And so it's a way of honoring them as well. If you zoom in for a closer look, they're having a conversation, each dressed in appropriate apparel. I draw your attention to the World War I character on the far left. Not only does he have the heavier clothing for a reason, but he also has a friend. A dog is there. What do you think the purpose of having a dog in an aircraft might be? Any thoughts? Steve Chappell, you look like you're a resident expert. Any thoughts as to why a pilot would want to take a dog with him up into the air?
Maybe prevention.
Could be that, but usually it's pretty noisy, pretty loud. You might be concerned the dog would even try to leap out. It's actually for warmth, because in the day there were no heaters. These were open cockpits, and that was his furnace. That was his radiator. How about that? And so it was not unusual that they would take those little furry critters along for a ride. Right above that display then is this triad. It's one of just a few, it's one of 2 that I can think of, aircraft that is actually a replica. So this one it never flew. It was actually built on the 50-year anniversary of their original. There were two replicas built. One did fly, and it burned in a museum fire. This was actually the Smithsonian's, but they gave it to, it transferred ownership to the NAS Museum some years ago. The thing about this, the A1 Triad, is that it could take off from water or land, and then it, of course, flew through the air. So tri meaning three. In 1911, a guy by the name of Glenn Curtis demonstrated this aircraft for the Navy, and he took off in New York, I think it was. He climbed to a blazing altitude of 25 feet and flew for 5 minutes. That was the start of naval aviation. Now, they had already made some adjustments. They added the extra wings, so to speak. Instead of curling the wings like the Wright brothers had done, mimicking what they saw the birds do, and warping them, they added that extra, what amounts to an aileron of sorts, and so some improvements. But the real challenge here is that when this is sitting in water, it creates suction. So how do you get that thing up out of the water? That takes a lot of energy, and they'll solve that problem in a big way by the time we get to one of our birds a little bit further along the way. While we're there looking at that beautiful bronze display and then the Triad above it, to your left is a display of aircraft carriers. That's not a central focus of our discussion here today. We're looking primarily at the aviation side, but they played a principal role, you do understand. Here several years ago was the 100-year anniversary, and the aircraft carrier is an incredible piece of technology. You're looking at 5 acres of U.S. sovereignty wherever it's floating, and manned by about 5,000 to 6,000 personnel. But for our purposes, the aircraft carrier had one primary goal, and that was to get aircraft out to the war zone and create what amounts to a floating runway for takeoff and for recovery. At first, just for takeoff, and then later they figured out a way to be able to land the aircraft as well. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 catapults. How do you take what is now a jet aircraft? And by the way, the angle deck came into existence along with jet technology because you needed more speed, both for landing approach and the ability to be able to go around if you missed your cable or whatever. So the 10.5-degree angle that you see here was not a part of the first aircraft carriers. So they launched these aircraft from 0 to about 150 knots in less than 3.5 seconds. I mean, woof, off they go. Obviously, you would not want to launch 2 of these at the same time. You'd have a slight problem there. And then the question arises, how do you recover these aircraft? So we go to the fantail section and we count 1, 2, 3, 4 arresting cables. The idea, the design is for the aircraft to come in flying at a speed that if it misses the cable, it has enough airspeed basically to just do a touch and go and then circle around and try again. I have nothing but the utmost admiration for a pilot who will put a plane down on a postage stamp floating in the middle of the ocean. One of the gentlemen that has helped us with our tours and make it available for us to get onto the base, Mr. Terry Ogle, used to teach here at Pensacola Christian College. And I remember the day he told me that his son had qualified with his first aircraft carrier landing. Boy, he was beaming with pride, and rightfully so. And then to make a nighttime landing, that's a whole nother thing. At any rate, the goal is to snag the second cable. It stretches out in a special way, and you go from 140 knots to 0 in less than 3 seconds. It's a controlled crash, and your earlobes wrap around your kneecaps in the process. So there you go. That's the essence of the aircraft carrier. But we're going to head on around the corner. On the way, I want to put in a shameless plug for some other naval vessels that you can visit while you're in the area or the next time you are here. 50 miles to the west, we've got the USS Alabama on display, and it is a Dakota-class battleship. I've had the opportunity of leading tours there as well, and I marvel at some of the statistics. These 6 guns, there are 3 more on the other side of the superstructure, are 16-inch guns. And if you were to turn all 9 of those sideways and fire a simultaneous volley, the energy expended would be enough to shove the ship sideways in the water 120 feet. And that's a huge ship. That's because they're using 3 90-pound sacks, silk-covered sacks of gunpowder behind each of those projectiles that weigh anywhere between 2,400 and 2,700 pounds. So it's worth your time to get to the USS Alabama. And then they have the drum there as well. It's in dry dock. If you're not too claustrophobic, you go right down into the submarine and take a close look there. They also have a wonderful B-52 on display. So there's a lot to the west. And then to the east of us 50 miles is the Armament Museum at Eglin Air Base. well worth your time. They have beautiful outdoor display. That's where the RS-71 is on display. Are you familiar with actually the SR? It was supposed to be called the RS, but somehow they transmuted those two terms, so we know it in reverse order now as the SR-71. That's the plane that took off from the West Coast and landed in Washington, D.C. 1 hour, 3 minutes, and 54 seconds later. In 1 hour across the entire continent. I was thinking that the only thing that goes into Washington, D.C. faster than that are Federal Reserve dollars being borrowed by our government. I'll try to keep politics out of this as much as possible, but I had to put that one in. If we had the ability to climb into that SR-71, we could actually be up at the Dayton Museum, which is the largest airplane museum in the world, in about 15 minutes or so. But we'll stay right here in town, and we're going to go around the corner, and our first display now has to do with World War I. We're in the World War I section of the Naval Museum here, and behind me is a British-made aircraft called the Camel. It was called that because there are two guns mounted on the top. There's a little hump there, and right in front of that hump is where they mounted those twin guns. These were synchronized guns so that they would not fire while the prop was in front of the muzzle. But one of the interesting things about this aircraft is that the engine actually spun around the crankshaft that was bolted to the frame. So the prop and the engine spun itself. The plane had great agility and all, but it had two major drawbacks. One, it'd throw castor oil all over the pilot from that engine spinning as it was, but then that gyro effect also caused the plane to want to drift off. On takeoff and landing especially, the plane had a gyro effect because of all that momentum, all of that inertia. But this was one of many of the innovations that came during what was called the Great War, many assuming that would be the only war of its sort. But as the rest of the museum shows, there will be a second Great War to come. Instead of having the engine mounted to the frame and the crankshaft and propeller spin, they reversed it. So the crankshaft is actually bolted to the frame, and the engine and propeller spin around it. That's what created that gyro effect, and everything wanted to go to the right. This is why the pilots that flew those aircraft hated to make left-hand turns. I only wish that their government would have learned to go right instead of left. All right, we move on. The question arises, though, what about these guns? And the first idea of trying to use airplanes for anything other than reconnaissance came in World War I. And the first attempts were pretty crude, actually, dropping bombs by hand, firing pistols at other pilots. And then someone said, why don't we strap a machine gun here? Now, we need it in line so we can see where the bullets are going. But that presents a problem. There's a prop spinning right in front of that. And so their solution was to bolt pieces of iron to the propeller so that as they pulled the trigger and the machine gun was shooting, it would just zing those rounds off that hit the propellers that crossed in front of the muzzle. And some of that lead came back toward the pilot too. So someone came up with a bright idea. Let's synchronize the guns. Let's tie them into the camshaft so that every time the prop goes in front of the muzzle, it holds that round or two. And there you have it. There were twin guns on the Camel that I mentioned to you a moment ago. This brings up another question, though. How did our planes, we being the Allies, compared to the German planes in World War I? The Germans were ahead technologically. They built a more aerodynamic plane. You can see even the landing gear here. The span here is aerodynamically shaped. They went with water-cooled instead of air-cooled. A little heavier, but they had a little bit more speed. And if you're in an air-to-air dogfight, 10 miles an hour makes a lot of difference. And so the Fokker had an advantage in that respect. What about the propellers? If they do get hit with a round, and that did happen more than once, it throws it out of balance and it vibrates terribly. So hopefully you're over friendly territory as a pilot so you can land, and a mechanic will come out and he'll measure the distance from that bolt hole. He'll go, a bullet hole rather, he'll go the opposite side, and with a bit and brace, he'll bore another hole in the propeller, and it's once again balanced, and off you go. How about that? The plane that 95% of Americans and Canadians trained on was this plane. Glenn Curtiss. You heard his name first with the triad. Glenn Curtiss never made it past the 8th grade, but he was just a natural talent when it comes to aircraft construction, and the Curtiss Company made quite a name for itself in the early running. So this is the Curtiss Jenny. It only generated about 60 horsepower or so. It could barely get over treetops and telephone lines and all, but it was water-cooled. And these actually were in great surplus following the war, so you could purchase them at a reasonable price. And one such purchase was made by a young man named Charles Lindbergh. And Charles had actually gone to college for 3 semesters. He was on the rifle team. One of their favorite pastimes was to hold a coin in their hand, and a guy would pace 25 paces off, turn around and shoot that thing out of his hand. How about that? But he gave up on college after 3 semesters, bought a motorcycle, and headed west to Nebraska. He wanted to learn how to fly. So he was taking private lessons. He got to that point where he was ready to solo, and they said, oh, by the way, before you can solo, you need to post bond for the cost of the airplane. Well, he had no money to do that, and so he decided to do something else instead. Bond in order to pilot, to solo. I don't have that kind of money. So he left his pilot training and became a wing walker. And this was the big thing in the late 20s and 30s, and it helped keep attention on aviation, where these guys would take off, 2-seater, and then as they're in flight, they would get out and walk on the bottom or even the top wing, back and forth as they're flying through the air. And the speed on these are under 100, but still dangerous enough to attract a crowd, because they would sell tickets for people to take rides in the aircraft. They would maybe fly over a fair, and they had a dummy stuffed in the back. So he would be walking on the wing, the plane would turn to where the crowd could no longer see Charles Lindbergh, and then the pilot would shove this dummy, and it would go flailing down toward the ground, and then the people would come running to where, and they want to see what happened, and then folks would say, you want to buy a ticket to fly? So that's how they recruited the passengers along the way. But it all began with this jetty, which really, and it was designed by Curtis, remember the guy who did get past the 8th grade, and this was a pivotal process here in American aviation. But if you looked up, right above us is this monstrosity right under the tail. This looks like it's a part of the framework of the building, isn't it? In fact, it's the NC-4. Let's learn about it. And this is what that NC-4 looks like. It's a huge aircraft built by the Curtis Company. One of the things that I marvel at is the ability of this thing to even get up out of the water. The thing was capable of carrying 28,000 pounds. It had 3, count them up, tractor engines and 1 pusher engine there at the back. You see that 4th radiator. This thing was just, it was actually built as a submarine hunter, and the original plan was to mount a gun up front here, so you could actually come up through and poke your head right up through here. But it's going to be used for a different purpose, as we shall soon hear. But I wanted you to put this into context. When the Wright brothers took off with their first aircraft, first successful heavier-than-air flight, they flew a distance of 120 feet in 59 seconds. Hold on to that status. Picture this. If the Wright brothers flyer were placed at that end of the wing, the first heavier-than-air flight would actually be shorter than that wingspan. Look at what progress has been made in that short amount of time. This was designed by Glenn Curtis, 8th grade education. My first question is, how does this thing even get off the ground, or out of the water in this case? We've got this hull up front. What they did, it was a very clever concept. We really can't see so well with the way it's placed here, but they put an indentation from the back of the hull to create less suction. You have to be able to get this thing up out of the air. It's got 3 tractors and 1 pusher, and the engine you see up there is the Liberty engine. We have 500 car companies and not a single company making airplane engines. When the Wright brothers made their engine, they literally took a piece of blank steel, scribed out the shape of the crankshaft, and asked the mechanics to chisel out and laid it down. This is the result of several of the masterminds coming together, 12 cylinders, offset, 400 horsepower, and they had this in production within 3 months. That's pretty incredible. So they have 4 of these nozzles on this aircraft. Its payload is 14,000 pounds, 6-member crew. It's still open cockpit. And one of the positions is right up in here. How would you like to be the lookout? Flying at blasting 85 miles an hour, but you're right up front of everything. And the United States Navy designed this as a submarine chaser in World War I. The notion was to place a gun right up here at the very tip, but the war ended before that could happen. And to try to keep interest in naval aviation, they decided, let's see if we can fly all the way across the Atlantic. It was designed for that purpose, because shipping them on board ships was hard, and so it had the fuel capacity and whatnot to be able to do it in jumps. You'd have to go up to Newfoundland, then fly to the Azores, and then from there to Portugal, and on from there. And there was actually a prize. The first people to be able to cross the Atlantic in the air would win this grand prize, but they changed the rules. But now you have to do it nonstop, which takes this plane out of the picture. It cannot do that. Charles Lindbergh will do that 8 years later. And take off from New York, fly up to Canada, fly all the way across, and they put destroyers at every 50-mile markers, and at night they would have lights on them, fire up rounds to help the folks keep on track. Of the 3 aircraft that took off for this transatlantic flight, 1919, 2 of them had to crash land in the fog. 1 was lost at sea. The crew was picked up, thankfully. The other was able to sail/taxi 200 miles to the Azores, but one of these aircraft made it all the way across. So this is the first aircraft to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Now, did it in steps, unlike Charles Lindbergh, who did his nonstop 8 years later, as we mentioned. Interestingly, this is still owned by the Smithsonian. And if they were to come back, I've heard the museum personnel say this, if the Smithsonian folk wanted the aircraft back, the request is that they not disturb the building in getting it out. So I think it's there for the long term, the NC-4. We go around the corner then as we get into the interwar years, and we introduce ourselves to the Grumman Aircraft Company. 2 months after the crash of 29, 6 men got together, including Leroy Grumman, and formed this brand new company. And the first plane they built, or one of the first planes, was the FF-1, affectionately known as the Fifi. If you look at this, there are several things about it that set it apart. 1, it has a metal fuselage. 2, it still has the wrapped wings, fabric. You notice the engine at the front, that's a radio engine, so the cylinders are in a circle, and they'd have these in banks sometimes. Very loud, look at that. Mufflers, no such thing as mufflers, just exhaust pipes and all. But there's something about the landing gear that is of interest. We see the enclosed cabin. I'm pointing that out because when I run the video, we don't have the angle to be able to see all of that. But let's listen in and see what made this aircraft unusual even for its day and time. On other ideas, retractable landing gear. That is going to add 200 miles range to this aircraft. It also has an enclosed cabin. The cockpit is now literally enclosed, so you don't have to take your dog anymore necessarily. One other factor you may not be aware of is that this is a variable pitch aircraft. The inventor of this airplane is a guy by the name of Leroy Grumman. This is the first in a whole series of fighters, the whole CAT series, the F-4 Wildcat, the F-6 Hellcat, the F-7 Tiger Cat, the F-8 was the, drawing a blank on that, the F-9 is the Panther. The whole CAT series comes from this. This is the very first. Notice the radio engine that we had before, but it doesn't spin. And some of these radio engines will actually have 3 banks of 9, 27 cylinders, and each is offset so the wind can sweep through. So this radio style will remain in fashion for a while. The water cool was heavy. It's a lot of extra weight to have the water in the jackets, the radiator. So this was the preferred route, though it does make the front end a little bit bulkier. So this was the first of a whole new series. Those that can see it, there's another plane very similar in size and dimension that does not have the retractable landing gear, and the differences are like night and day. And so the Grumman factory, which was launched in 1929, just after the crash, not long was surviving the one to build the CAT series. They built the F-14 you saw out front. They are the ones that built the Space Lunar Module. So Grumman is around to stay. We're watching the clock, so I'm just going to point out back here, this metal airplane that you see right there, that was built by Ford. So Ford built cars, he built tractors, he built airplanes. This was called the Metal Goose, made out of corrugated metal, 3 engines. It really was not popular in the military, but executives used planes like this to fly from place to place. So we turned from the F-1 to the F-3, but on the way there, just a few ABCs to understand the terminology and nomenclature. If you see an A in front of the aircraft by name, A7, A6, A10, that means it's an attack aircraft. If you see the letter B, it's a bomber, B-24, B-25, B-29, B-52. C stands for cargo, and so a C-130 is not designed to be a bomber, it's designed to carry heavy cargo. If you see the letter F, that stands for fighter. So we have the F-4F during World War II, the F-6F, etc. And then there was another term that was popular, no longer used today, and that's the term pursuit. The P-40, the P-47, the P-51. So that nomenclature will help us as massive sense to it. We're there to protect the bombers or whatever. The ABCs of naval aviation, this goes primarily for naval, but it works for some of the others too. A is attack, B is bomber, C is cargo. So if you have a C-135, that's a cargo plane. If it's a P-47, that's a pursuit type aircraft, which, well, A would be attack, an A-6, an A-10, those are attack aircraft. But this is a fighter, the F-3F, as it was called, 3 blades instead of 2, the same retractable landing gear, but a significant difference here is that the variable pitch is now controlled by the pilot. And I realize that some may not know the value of variable pitch, so let me share this illustration. If you get on a bicycle that has multiple gears, the adults who know about this, 10 speed, 12 speed, it's hard to start out in 12th gear, isn't it? All of that resistance, because you have that ratio, is such as it is. If you can start out in first gear, well, you can get some momentum, then you shift to a higher gear, and when you're going at a good solid clip, you've got momentum, then you kick it into overdrive, 12th gear. Same thing with variable pitch. You don't want, picture this to be a screw. It's carving its way through the air like a screw, and each of these blades is inclined. It's really sort of like a wing. And the Wright brothers had to figure this thing out for themselves. They had no computers, they had no engineering software. They got their propeller within 10% efficiency of what's used today. Phenomenal. With none of the background. At any rate, what you want when you take off is a very light pitch. Less bite into the wind, because you need lots of RPM economy. Okay? The first one you set before you took off the ground. You can set it to take off fast, or you can set it to fly a long distance, but you could not control it in the air. And woe be the mechanic who tried to change the pitch while he was running. In this case, the pilot can actually control it from in the aircraft itself through using the motor oil through a set of hydraulics. It's a very clever invention that they came up with, a set of gears and all, very complicated, but what a breakthrough that was.
At the end of World War II, when the B-29 that was used to drop the atomic bomb was built, it was actually retrofitted with variable pitch propellers to where it could back up on the ground. First time ever. So that all started in the interwar years, and now we head to World War II. One of the planes you saw in the background was the P-40, and we can't bypass it by any means. The very first history seminar that we presented here at college was in 1995 in this very location. The multimedia auditorium, and it was on the Flying Tigers. This was their bird. It's an unusual plane in some respects, British built, 12 cylinders inline. It had that long nose or beak to it. They came back after the fact and retrofitted it with armor seat and self-sealing tanks. A gel inside of the tank so that if it does take a round, instead of the fuel seeping out and catching fire, it would self-seal. But all of that threw off the center of gravity. Our middle son is an A&P mechanic as well as a certified flight instructor, and so he knows well. In fact, he does this kind of work. If they add equipment to a plane, they have to recalculate where the center of gravity is. Well, this threw that off, so it made it a hard plane to fly, but it also gave it an unusual characteristic that we'll learn more about after we introduce ourselves to this man, Claire Chennault. Claire Chennault had served in the military. He did not get along all that well with the upper high brass, so he parted ways in 1937, but he had tremendous flying skills. Listen to this excerpt as to the things he would do when he was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama.
And so the United States wanted to remain neutral, but we supported China. So Claire Chennault, who had cashiered out of the military in 1937, he never got along well with his superiors. He had this sense that the future of aviation would be these fighter-type, pursuit-type aircraft. And they said, no, we're building bigger and faster bombers. The era of the fighters went away. Well, they miscalculated that one. And so he basically parted company. He went off to China, and he got permission then to come back to Pensacola and recruit aviators right out of our Navy. One of the guys he recruited was a guy named Black Sheep Squadron Leader Robinson. Some of you know about him. He was actually coming into Pensacola to train how to fly. He went to the San Carlos Hotel, signed an agreement with Claire Chennault the next day, and became a Flying Tiger. Who is this Claire Chennault? When he was a pilot at Maxwell Field in Montgomery, he would take his P-12 and fly under the bridge on his way home to lunch. He'd literally fly under the bridge upside down. And he did that routinely. This is a guy that would throw his dogs into the back of the plane, fly to Louisiana, his home state, hunt game, strap the game to the wings, and fly back to Montgomery. He was a character. That's Claire Chennault. And so he was hired by the Chinese to try to help slow the Japanese invasion. And he got permission to come to Pensacola, and he signed about 90 pilots out of the training program into this volunteer group that came to be called the Flying Tigers. It was Claire Chennault who apparently made the discovery that if you take this plane up to about 19,000 feet and put it into a steep dive, it is the fastest prop-driven airplane in the air, surpassing any other. And he said, now, you don't try to engage those Kates and those Zeros in a one-to-one battle. No dogfighting here, because a Zero can turn on a dime and give you 5 cents change. What you do instead is, as you're coming down steep dive, you activate those two 50 caliber guns that are situated in the nose of that aircraft. This is a 50 caliber round, and they had that in sequences of 5, 2 incendiaries, 2 armor piercers, and then 1 tracer. They were set to converge at 300 yards. Fearsome, fearsome. And then as you sweep by, you come down below and up from behind. We call them drive-by shootings. So you don't try to engage, you just do those quick down and behind. And those 90-plus pilots shot down 299 aircraft in 6 months. It's a 20-to-1 ratio there, kill ratio. Never repeated anywhere else. And theoretically, in all probability, they helped to keep the Japanese from connecting across the Indian Hump, maybe linking up with Hitler himself. So they played a vital role. In time, the Flying Tigers were absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Corps and went on to do their own thing there. Claire Chennault stayed with him. He was a character. He would build these fake-looking aircraft and put them on display out there, and the Japanese would come in to bomb them. And he set up this net, as it was called. He had one fellow that volunteered to work with him, a guy by the name of John Birch. He was a missionary to China, had graduated from J. Frank Norris's Institute out in Texas, had gone to China and learned the language in half the time. When he signed in to join the military, he wanted to be a chaplain. And Chennault said, I have enough chaplains, but you have the Chinese language. We're going to make you a member of the OSS. And he agreed, but he was allowed to preach as much as he wanted. So we have good reason to believe that the folks in that squadron heard a good gospel witness. But what John Birch would do is he'd go out with these radio transmitters, and he'd just go visit the churches that he'd helped to plant and ministered in, and he'd give those radios to the Chinese that were behind enemy lines. So he'd disguise himself as a Chinese coolie, and he would carry these transmitters. And then whenever they saw planes flying overhead or even ships moving along the coastline, they would radio that to Claire Chennault's headquarters. They have this huge map, and they put pins as they got those messages. And pretty soon they could predict, oh, they're going this direction, and this is how many. And then he'd scramble these P-40s. It was a phenomenal concept all the way along the way. I told you that Claire Chennault did not get along well with the upper brass. One of the guys was named Bissell. You study the life of General Bissell. His name comes up several times, he and Marshall. And many in the military didn't care for them very much. And I'm a little off script here, but I'm just sharing this because we shared this in the Flying Tiger storyline right here in 1995. So they would, whenever they met aircraft, they would courteously open the door and they would curse Bissell. And they do that routinely, and one day they opened the door and did that, and it was Bissell getting out of the plane. Not a good idea, for what it's worth. But these P-40s really made quite a name for themselves, despite some of the idiosyncrasies in their flying ability. We would be remiss if we went on through our tour without making mention of the pride of Pensacola, the Blues. The Blue Angels make Pensacola their home, and we're going to look to the atrium where they host a number of wonderful ceremonies and all, and we'll see the A6 on display. Nowadays, they use the F-18, and when those planes take off and put that into a hammerhead roll, climbing upwards of 60,000 feet while spinning, it's phenomenal. I was tempted to put in some footage from that, but I have a problem. My family teases me about this. Whenever I videotape the Blue Angels, I usually get clear blue sky. I miss the planes. They're going by so fast. So we'll have to just settle for the static display here. So let's see if we can take a listen. But I do want to draw to your attention a couple things to my left, your right. First, the beautiful Blue Angel display that you see here. This is the A6 that was used until 1985. Some of you were students at the college when this was the demonstration team aircraft. You see that those wingtips in some instances are within 3 feet of one another. That is not exaggeration. In real-time flight, those wingtips at points are less than 3 feet apart. going 400 miles an hour. There's not a lot of room for error. Nowadays you use the F-18 Hornet. That's a fly-by-wire technology. You grab a joystick and that's how you fly the plane. It's like flying a video game, right? But the tolerances are such that you would be crashing into one another right and left if you used a standard joystick. So they attach a 30-pound test weight spring. So it's a lot harder to push it one way or the other. They say that when a Blue Angels pilot has finished his tour, his right arm and bicep are much stronger than his left. From all of that experience, there's a lady pilot actually that's a part of that group right now. And so that's the A6. Now further over, if you look carefully, and I need to get the right laser in hand here again, you see that yellow aircraft hanging? It's by wing. That is a Stearman. That is the type aircraft. In fact, that is the airplane that George Herbert Walker Bush trained in twice. He flew that plane up in Minnesota while he was in training as an 18-year young boy. He went on to fly the Avenger bomber, which was the heaviest bomber that could take off from an aircraft carrier, and his plane was shot down. As it was bursting into flames, he bailed out of the craft. His co-pilot did not make it, and he parachuted down. He had a big cut on his forehead, injuries to his upper body, and he landed in the water there. And there was a guy on the nearby island who saw two submarines coming toward him at the same time. One Japanese, one American. You know which one won the race. There was another fellow, 17 years young, Jerry was his name. Not an aviation story, but related. He was on board the USS Monterey under Halsey's command. And they were in stormy conditions, a typhoon of sorts. When the battle alarm sounded, it was a fire that had broken out. And so as he assumed his battle station, stepping out on deck, he lost his footing and slid across that angled deck. There's a little 1-inch rim welded all the way around to keep tools from rolling overboard in calm seas. His heels caught that as he slid overboard. He managed to twist 180 degrees and grab onto some rope netting. And as he was swinging there, 70 feet above the water in this typhoon-type condition, all he could think of was Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Lean not into thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. A verse to so that his mom had taught him. They were able to get him back on up on deck. Another sailor was washed overboard and lost in that particular incident. And Jerry went on to become Gerald Ford. There was another reporter here in World War II that was going to be on a plane. It's sort of like a jump seat position. He excused himself to go use the restroom, came back, someone had taken his place. And he didn't have the leverage to get them to move. That plane took off and was never heard of again. It was Lyndon B. Johnson who missed his flight. So we could regale you with accounts like that from World War II time after time. While I'm in that mode, old timers will remember this name when it comes out. This was not Navy aviation, it was Army in Italy. I think it was Hill 112. And there was a guy named Robert Crassity who was terribly injured. His friend, also named Robert, crawled across through gunfire, got to him, and gave him the maximum amount of morphine allowable, wrote the letter M in blood, using the guy's blood as ink, and dragged him to safety. Years later, at one of those reunions of that cavalry group, as it was called, Robert Crassity came over to the other fellow, Robert, to say thank you. His name was Bob Dole. So we could go on with story after story. Those are just a few examples. But as we turn our attention to the next airplane, this is one that has a special place in my heart as a historical reenactor. And that, of course, is the story of the B-25. We actually did a presentation on the Doolittle Raiders here in 2022. We recorded the trailer for that right here in the museum that we're traveling through virtually. So let's take a listen. Hello, my name is Jacob DeShazer, or Jake for short. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led a special secret mission that came to be known as the Doolittle Raid. The purpose here was to avenge the attack on Pearl Harbor and to send a message to the Japanese that while America may be down, she was not out. I was a bombardier on board the 16th of those aircraft, one of which you see behind me, a B-25 Mitchell bomber. And from that vantage point, I had a unique perspective and could watch the whole drama unfold. I would like to invite you to join me for a special presentation, one in which we'll examine the men, the mission, and the machines, in a talk entitled Dancing with Death, the Doolittle raid and its impact. Oh, one more thing. I was one that was captured by the Japanese and spent 40 months, most of those in solitary confinement. But there was something that happened there that literally had a life-changing effect on me. But you're going to have to come hear that story in person. I'll see you there. Do you know that just 50 miles from where we're located today, the Doolittle Raiders did their practicing? Now, they didn't know what the secret raid was. They just know that they were going to be doing some secret mission. Jake DeShazer had grown up in a Methodist church, but he turned from the gospel, turned from Christianity, taken on the ways of the world. And he was actually on KP duty the day Pearl Harbor was bombed. He was on KP duty because of his carousing over the weekend. And he was so angry, he hurled a potato against the wall and cursed the Japanese, vowed vengeance. A short time later, when he was given the invitation to join this secret mission as a bombardier, sign me up. Most of his squadron signed up, so he did too. And they ended up here at Eglin Air Base at a place called Duke Field. It was not called that. It was Auxiliary Field number 3 at the time, but it's now Duke Field. And that's where they did their training in the B-25 bomber. How do you distinguish the B-25 from the B-24? The B-24 has twin tails just like this one does, but it has 4 engines instead of 2. That's how you can tell the difference. So this was the largest plane that they calculated could take off from an aircraft carrier, and the plan was to basically reconstruct the Pearl Harbor attack in reverse. Let's follow the same route, get as close as we can to Japan, ideally within 300 miles or so, and then we'll just run a bombing sortie and fly on to safe zones in China. That was the plan. None of the pilots or the crew knew about that at this point. So they trained right here in Florida, and the runway had a white line painted on it 500 feet down the way. They weren't told why. They were simply told, you need to be off of the ground before you pass that line. And they had flags every 50 feet. Jacob DeShazer tells how that their first attempt was a fiasco. You know, they were 750, 800 feet. They're supposed to have at least 1,500 feet to take off of this aircraft, 3,200 feet if it's loaded, and they're being asked to do it in 500 feet? How in the world? They'd lock the brakes, rev the engines to full speed. I mean, the thing was gyrating and vibrating like it's going to fall apart, and then they'd release those brakes and they'd be on the way. Of course, this is a prime position. This is a good real estate to be in. You can see all the action. So they trained here for some time, made their way to the West Coast, and then those planes were hoisted aboard the Hornet. That was the CV-6. You can tell how old an aircraft carrier is by that hull number, and this was the 6th one. It was just a flat deck. It didn't have the angled deck or anything like that. Did not have any of the cables for recovering aircraft. This was simply a floating runway to get close enough to Japan to try to launch this mission. The planes, if they kept the left wheel on the white line and the nose gear on the center line, as they passed the superstructure, they'd have 6 feet of clearance between the wing and the superstructure. Actually, Doolittle had about 450 feet to work with. They'd taken the top half of the bomb bay and converted it into fuel space, so we were only carrying half of the complement of bombs we normally would. The plan had been for him to take off early and sort of, scope things out and all, and then we were going to leave sometime later so we'd arrive by day and be able to fly to China by day. But 700 miles out, a picket discovered the Hornet. And the question now was, do we abort and just turn back, or do we launch what amounts to a suicide mission? There's no way you can fly 700 miles, drop your bombs, and then get all the way to China. It's just not going to happen. But Doolittle opted to go for it anyway. So at 8 o'clock on April 18, that's the same day, by the way, that Paul Harvey made his famous ride. Remember Paul Revere. Where did Harvey come from? I was thinking of the commentator. Paul Revere made his famous ride on April 18, 1775, and now 1942, April 18, here comes a warning, so to speak. Oh, by the way, do you know what Paul Revere's famous last words were when he finished that ride? Whoa. In this case, they're using aircraft. I'll quit horsing around here. And so he only had 450 feet to work with. There's a flagman way up there at the front of the ship. They're in heavy seas, 30-mile-an-hour winds, which were to their advantage, because now turning into the wind, they had a little extra lift. So the idea was to rev those engines, brakes locked, and as soon as that flagman dropped the flag, release the brakes, and there you go. But picture the scene, if you can climb inside that cockpit for just a moment. As the flagman dropped the flag,
Doolittle and crew is looking right down the deck into the trough of the sea because the bow of the ship is down. That takes a lot of courage and faith, hoping that the bow's going to come up before you get to the end. It did, and he circled around to get his location, lock in his navigation equipment, and to say, hey, we did it, and the others took off. We were plane number 16, way in the back as I role-played Jacob DeShazer. We had a little incident occur there, unfortunately. First of all, our tail was sticking out over the water. That's how tight things were. And the plane in front of us, when they fired the engines, a lot of wind and all blowing, it pushed a sailor into one of our props. And it just cut his arm off just like that. I actually helped carry him to the side as Jacob DeShazer's character here. And he looked up at me and said, give him H. And so we climbed in the plane, but that plane in the process had backed up and accidentally broken one of the panes in our canopy. And I'm right up front. If we tell the folk there on board the ship what happened, they would abort us. We would not be allowed to fly. So, mum was the word. And we took off about 2 hours after the first flight had taken off. And with 230-mile-an-hour winds blowing into my canopy, I tried stuffing a coat in there. I tried stuffing, I couldn't do it. So we just put up with the wind and we flew our sortie. 30 seconds over Tokyo is what it was called. And then we were flying over China by night. And as our plane ran out of fuel, fortunately we made land. When we ran out of fuel, we parachuted into the darkness. I was soon captured. Of the 80 participants, 3 were killed when their planes landed. 8 of us were captured, 3 of whom were executed, as I was just shot with firing squad. 1 starved to death, and 4 of us survived the war. But spoiler alert, it was while I was there that I came to saving faith. It's an incredible story. Basically, this is how I wrote it up in my book. They're telling that story. We were not what you call religious men before we were captured, but we were given a Bible to read. That was my request. I hated the Japanese. I mean, there was a rancor of just eating me through to the very marrow of the bone. But I asked for a Bible, and I began reading, and my mind went back to what I'd heard in that Methodist church growing up. And by the time we finished, all 4 of us had accepted Christ as our Savior. So we were freed twice when the war came to an end. Everyone want to venture a guess as to what my first food request was? Ice cream. Can you blame me? If you wanted to watch that presentation, and it's a great evangelistic tool. When we did this talk, we actually invited folks from Eglin Air Base, who, as far as I know, did not have spiritual interest. I've used this in other settings. It's a way to get the gospel to people that would not even darken the doors of a church. It's a phenomenal story. I'll give this one extra since we're close on time, but you've listened well today. Jacob DeShazer wrote his story into tract form. That tract was handed to Matsuo Fuchida during the post-war hearings that MacArthur was conducting. He was a Buddhist. He stuffed it into his coat, went on his way, but later pulled it out and began to read. Through a sequence of events, he got saved. So these 2 arch enemies now became brothers in Christ, and they literally traveled the United States in the 1950s telling their wonderful testimony. If you watch the video, you get that and more. We need to move on. The results of the Doolittle raid, well, it could do little to put a dent in the military-industrial complex, but it sent a message to the Japanese in this case, that they were not beyond reach. So now they began to overextend themselves. The blue area you see highlighted is 5 times the size of Germany. Most of it watery or waste, but they tried to move south toward the Coral Sea. They're going to try to move east. The result of these are battles. The Battle of Coral Sea, that was April 42. So the raid, May I think it was. So our raid was in April 42, and within a month we were able to stop the Japanese. Interesting deal about the Battle of Coral Sea. It's the first time that opposing flotillas never saw one another. The ships were 100 miles apart. All of the work was done by airplanes. Pay attention to the torpedo plane because that will come into play at the Battle of Midway. The third attempt up toward the Aleutians was, I think, pretty much, the Aleutians was an illusion, I should say. But zeroing in on the Battle of Midway for just a little while, the 2 planes of note, the Devastator and the Dauntless dive bomber, I had a chance to attend a symposium. There were 2,000 World War II vets in attendance, and they brought back aviators from both the American and the Japanese side. They had interpreters there. Phenomenal. I just soaked it up like a sponge. And there was a fellow that told a story that I'd never heard or read before about the F-6F fighters that were supposed to be guarding the torpedo planes. Here we have the F-6F, which was a modified version of the fighter aircraft. This was one of the first aircraft to have the self-sealing tanks built in. I had the chance to attend a symposium on the Battle of Midway, and a fella from the audience of some 2,000 World War II veterans stepped to a microphone and told the story how that his squadron, he was in charge of such a group of these aircraft, climbed to cruising altitude. They were supposed to be protecting the torpedo planes. And he looked down at his fuel and saw that he was actually much lower than he had anticipated. And the cardinal rule is never run out of fuel over the water. So his squadron turned back to refuel, but somehow the torpedo planes were never notified. And so when they came in low and slow as they do, the Japanese Zeros were waiting for them, and they just swarmed down on them. The results were devastating. And in one squadron, 31 out of the 35 aircraft were destroyed. There was another squadron where all of the planes were shot down. One pilot survived. But the havoc was wrought by the Zero aircraft. There's a Zero aircraft hanging up above us here, and that plane just had a devastating effect on those bombers, on those torpedo planes, which had been effective at the Battle of Coral Sea. And so the Japanese were ready, they were laying in wait. Well, during all of that activity, where the Zeros came down out of the high skies to the ocean level, that left these planes basically uninhibited. So here come the Curtiss Dauntless bombers, and their goal would be to drop into this steep dive, and the wings have air brakes to actually slow the plane so it doesn't vibrate apart as it's coming down in these screaming dives. And their job was to try to drop a bomb right on top of these aircraft carrier. In a 5-minute span from roughly 10:30 to 10:35 a.m., there at the Battle of Midway, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, 3 different carriers. A 4th one would sink before the end of the day. It broke the back of the Japanese Navy, and they never did recover fully from that. That pilot telling his story that had his gunner shot to death behind him, bled out, shot through the knees, so he had no return firepower. He said that at least 10 Zeros, he figured at least 10 Zeros had been on his tail, not in simultaneously, but in sequence. And he remembers something that his trainer has taught him. If you ever get in a bind, get low and get slow, because those Zeros fly at about 300 miles an hour. And so he would get low, he did, low and slow, right down on the deck, and he would look over his shoulder. You could see those 20-millimeter guns kicking up the water, 10 feet apart, and he'd go through an evasive maneuver. Then the next one would come through, and he expended his ammunition time and time again. He said the 10th guy emptied all of his ammunition, came right up alongside at low level, looked over at the American pilot telling the story, and he said, if I saw him today, I'd still recognize him. And he said, the Japanese saluted me as if to say, congratulations, you survived, or hold on, I'm going back for more ammunition. He said, I didn't stick around to find out. He limped back to his aircraft carrier. But all of that opened the high skies so that in 5 minutes, 3 aircraft carriers were destroyed for the Japanese, a 4th by the end of the day. The Yorktown had been heavily damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea. They had gotten back to the West Coast, and they estimated 3 months to refurbish. They said you have 3 days. So 2,200 technicians scrambled over that ship, rewiring all, and as it was steaming back out to sea, it was still being under construction. My dad served on board a destroyer in World War II, the USS Gansevoort, and he was just 17 years young. They basically handed him a diploma in January of his senior year and said, go serve Uncle Sam. He actually went under the Golden Gate Bridge. This particular destroyer had been hit by a suicide aircraft and had blown up the second boiler, killed 15, wounded 30. And so he's headed out, and he's looked up at the Golden Gate Bridge. He told me this many, many years later. He wondered if he'd ever see it again. 17 years young, how about that? We're losing 2,000 of those World War II vets every day. If you happen to know any, take advantage, talk to them, thank them for their service, ask them for their story. They're more apt to talk about it now than they were 40 years ago. But the Yorktown it got heavily damaged again at this battle, so our own submarine sunk it. We are just about out of time, so we need to close things out. 2 other quick stories, if you allow. This is the PBY Catalina, used for recon purposes and all. One fellow, George Raptus, was co-captain. He was not having a good day, not feeling well, and so he stepped to a side waste pod to deposit his breakfast into the ocean below. When he looked down and saw something that was apt to change the entire theater of war, what would he have seen that would make such an impact? It was actually a Zero aircraft, perfectly intact, upside down there on an island. So they marked the place there, and they told the naval folk about it. They sent a barge out. They lifted that thing off. Apparently the pilot had come in on a dead stick landing, had run out of fuel, and he thought it was a safe landing area, but it was swamp. And when the landing gear hit, it stuck. He flipped, obviously did not survive, but the plane did. And they shipped that plane back to the West Coast, put it into a hangar, and they went over that rivet by rivet. And one of the things they learned is if that plane exceeds 300 miles an hour, the oversized rudder makes the plane stiff and hard to maneuver. And that would certainly play a role as the war unfolds. Above, we have another that's fully intact. These planes were capable of flying long distances. They were great for patrols up in the Aleutians and all. And there's a window up front through which they can have their cameras and instrument. How do you keep that window clean? That was such a problem. They tried windshield wipers, they tried special liquids, and then one day a sailor mechanic said, if you'll make an opening for me, I'll just open the hole and clean it with a cloth. So that's what they did. But they also carried lots of pencils on board because sometimes the landings were rough and it popped these rivets. And the rivet is the exact size of a pencil. Poke the pencil in, it stops the leak until the thing can be repaired. This is the Zero, sometimes called the George. They typically named the Japanese aircraft as such. Very fine, sleek aircraft. Capable of 300 miles an hour, but above that speed, it gets to be stiff and hard to fly. It does not have an armored seat. It does not have self-sealing tanks, and that was the real downside of that aircraft. I wish we had time to take you on over to the first jet engine aircraft, the Messerschmitt 262. Time is just getting away on us for that, but I would be regretful if I didn't tell you one other quick story. It's a story of courage and valor from the Vietnam era. Do understand there's an entire building behind the one that we've been virtually touring, an entire building that we didn't get to. But there's one bird I want you to learn about. I alluded to it in my opening sequence. Let's go there now. We have one of the most incredible stories, in my estimation, displayed in the plane that you see twirling behind me. This is not a story I share with most folks. I tell people you need to go to the museum to read the placard for yourself, but you're taking this course by distance learning, and so I'll indulge you. The war was coming to an end, the Vietnam War. It's April of 1975, and at this point, the South Vietnamese had surrendered. The Americans are pulling out. It's just a time of great tragedy in many respects. But amidst that tragedy, there was this incredible story. A Vietnamese major was able to take off from an island and fly this little civilian aircraft, a Cessna, out toward the sea. He had about 1 hour's worth of fuel left whenever he saw the Midway, the aircraft carrier. His first two attempts to communicate by way of dropping messages failed, and if I remember correctly, the third time around he wrote the message and wrapped it around a revolver and threw it onto the deck of the rain-slickened Midway. And the message essentially read, I've got 1 hour of fuel left. Can you move those helicopters? I can land on your ship. And they did move the helicopters, and he came in. He bounced once and rolled to a stop well short of the end of the runway. He made his first carrier aircraft landing, but the story doesn't end there. As the doors opened, out came his wife, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. Now you look at that bird and ask yourself, how could 5 children plus 2 adults fit into that aircraft? I have no clue. The crew, they're so moved by this whole account that they took the family in, they adopted them, came stateside, they got their citizenship, and the last I checked, 3 of the 5 children had advanced degrees, lawyers, accountants, all thriving, doing very well. I wish I could tell the same happy ending to the story of so many other boat people that tried to escape Vietnam in the years that followed. Unfortunately, many of them died, drowned along the way. But here's one of those stories that does have a happy ending to it. And I wanted you to see one of the few non-naval aircraft that's on display here at the museum. Picture behind me, the Cessna Bird Dog. On the 50th year anniversary, the captain or skipper of that aircraft carrier and Major Lee got together for a special celebration at the museum. The family was recognized and a plaque was presented to them at that time. Well, there's a whole lot that we have to leave on the table, but time has elapsed for us here. I want to thank you for your time here today and hope that you found it informative. If anything, our takeaway is that we see man's perseverance and God's providence at work as we study the pages of the past. Thanks so much. God bless, and you are dismissed.